Got it? Thank you. Good to see you all this morning. A little bit different arrangement. I decided since you weren't going to come to me, I'd come to you. So I moved the podium back this direction, and I'll try to get you all in view here this morning. Bill and Larry are both gone this morning, so you just have me to deal with. They didn't ask for my permission for both be gone on the same Sunday, but when they told me, I told them they couldn't, and that didn't change their minds. So it shows you how much influence I have. We're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 29 and 30 this morning and finish our studies in the book of 1 Samuel. And it's interesting that we have a battle scene, especially since we're honoring veterans today, and Veterans Day is this week. I thought it was an interesting coincidence. By way of introduction, a couple of weeks ago, in fact, it was October the 18th, there were massive protests across our land from the No Kings movement. The news was full of it. There were over 2,000 gatherings around our country. They estimate 5 million people. They weren't spontaneous. It was a carefully orchestrated effort to detract from President Trump. Their website said, "We stand against unchecked power." There was a lot more to it than that, obviously. I looked into the funding of an event that large. And it's interesting, the people, the organizations, the groups that really coordinated, organized, and financed this massive protest. Christy Walton, yes, the Walmart family, was one of the major contributors. George Soros, if you recognize that name, he's one of the most prolific donators to liberal political causes. Reverend Al Sharpton, does that surprise you? And finally, and this wasn't all, but the ACLU. So, a No Kings movement. The reason I mention that is God had a No Kings movement that 1 Samuel talks about too. He did not want his people to be governed by earthly kings. He wanted a theocracy that was governed by godly spiritual leaders. And that happened up until the time when the nation began to demand a king. And I think today's conclusion to the book of 1 Samuel will help us understand a little more why God did not want a king, especially a king that was not submissive to him. For America, however, that was not the first No Kings movement that we experienced in the past few weeks. There was one in the late 1700s when the colonists said, "We don't want to be governed by someone over whom we have no say, we have no control." And of course, that led to the founding of our country, America. Let me begin by just reading the first 3 verses of 1 Samuel 29 under the heading of the caution of the Philistines. Now, the title of this lesson I've given was David Finishes What Saul Didn't. And you'll see that as we go through these chapters. We've considered 21 lessons in 1 Samuel, all of them under the umbrella idea of God in control of history. And while it might seem like things are spinning out of control, we are assured by Scripture that God is still in control. So verse 1 of chapter 29. Now the Philistines gathered together all their armies to Aphek, and the Israelites pitched by a fountain which is in Jezreel. And I mentioned last week that there was a valley in between the two encampments. And the lords of the Philistines passed on by hundreds and by thousands, but David and his men passed on in the reward, that's the review, with King Achish. Achish was part of the Philistine army. He had his followers that he had brought. Verse 3 tells us one of the problems that came with Achish. Then said the princes of the Philistines, "What do these Hebrews here?" And Achish said unto the princes of the Philistines, "Is this not David, the servant of Saul, the king of Israel, which hath been with me these days, or these years? And I have found no fault in him since he fell unto me unto this day." So the armies were standing in review, the Philistine armies. And to the surprise of some of the leaders, they saw some Hebrews there. David being one of them, and of course the men that he had brought with them. Well, this was, I think, a great surprise is an understatement. And they asked the question, what are they doing here? They are the enemy. But Achish vouched for them, said he has been serving me, and David and his people had been in Ziklag for a year and 4 months. He had been raiding, unknowns to King Achish, other Philistine territories, but Achish thought that he was raiding in Jewish territories and that he was ready to fight for them, and that's why he allowed him to come. So there was this scrutiny by the rank and file, which is normal in a military organization. The question being answered, are they ready? Are their uniforms in order? Are their weapons ready? Are they confident? Well, then came the surprise after the scrutiny that David was there. For David, this was a difficult situation now. Here he was in the middle of a Philistine army. His own people were on the opposite side of the valley, and shortly these two armies were going to engage in battle. At least the Philistines were going to attack the Israelites. And what was David going to do? He had put himself in a tight spot. When he tried to hide from Saul, that was his latest place of refuge, was in Philistine territory. In fact, he'd done that twice. This was the second time. But now he was put in a position, well, either he's going to fight his own people on behalf of the Philistine army, or, as the Philistine leaders suspected, he's going to be a turncoat. In the middle of the battle, he's going to turn on us, and then we're going to have a problem in the middle of us as well as the problem in the front of us. So they demanded that Achish dismiss David. To this situation David finds himself in, he didn't have a solution. He didn't know what to do, but God did. And that was helpful to me when I began to think through this. You know, you ever come across situations where you don't know what to do? You don't know the decision that's going to bring the best outcome. In spite of the information that you have, you're puzzled. If I do this, certain consequences are going to happen. If I go the other way and do that, the consequences are going to be different, but still unknown and somewhat troubling. So David didn't have a solution, but God did. So beginning in verse 4, David and his men leave. Verse 4 says, "And the princes of the Philistines were wroth with him." It's talking about King Achish. "And the princes of the Philistines said unto him, Make this fellow return, that he may go again to the place which thou hast appointed him, and let him not go down with us to battle, lest in the battle he be an adversary to us. For wherewith should he reconcile himself unto his master? Should it not be with the heads of these men? In other words, how's David going to ingratiate himself back with King Saul, whom they realized he was running from and hiding from? Well, if he could go back with a victory over our army, then he's going to be accepted by Saul. And so they demanded that he, because of their awareness of his past exploits, and they knew David's capabilities. In fact, they said, is not this the man whom they sang about killing his 10,000s after Saul had killed his thousands? So they rejected King David. And he does what Achish demands that he do. He leaves with his army. God had sovereignly intervened on David's behalf. David didn't have a solution to this, but God did. Beginning in verse 6, Achish dismisses David and his folk leave. They went back to Ziklag, where they had been living for the last year and 4 months. With God's blessing now, God had intervened on their behalf. But their return to Ziklag now, which is chapter 30, throws a very different light on the whole situation. This chapter is really background to the lesson titled, David Finishes What Saul Didn't. And I go back a little bit in the book of 1 Samuel to kind of refresh our memories. In 1 Samuel 15, Saul had attacked an Amalekite settlement, and under specific instructions from God, he was to destroy everything. If we were to go back and read that, it might be a little unsettling, because God said, destroy all the possessions, destroy all the people, even to the infants. And that kind of jars our sensibilities to think that God was that austere in his denunciation of the Amalekites. But to go back a little further, when Moses was leading the Israelites across the Sinai, they came to a place called Rephidim, which was a place of blessing for them. But while they were there, they were attacked by the Amalekites, who were a long way from their homeland. There was no reason for them to attack God's people. There was no rational explanation of why they did this, but it caused a great deal of difficulty for the Israelites. And at that time, God pronounced judgment on the Amalekites. And the language is very specific in 1 Samuel 15, that God eventually said, I'm going to destroy them. So that brings us to where we are here in 1 Samuel 30 now. David goes back to Ziklag, and he finds nothing. Everything has been destroyed. They were physically tired. It took them 3 days, the scripture tells us, to march across the country and arrive back in Ziklag. And when they got there, this is what they found. We'll begin at verse 1 of chapter 30. And it came to pass, when David and his men were come to Ziklag on the 3rd day, that the Amalekites had invaded the south and Ziklag, and smitten Ziklag, and burned it with fire. That wasn't the biggest problem. Verse 2, and had taken the women captives that were therein. They slew not any, neither great or small, but carried them away and went on their way. So they had kidnapped all of the people, including the women, including David's 2 wives, Abigail and Ahinoam. David and his army didn't know that at the time, that they were still alive, but you can understand, even if they had, there was still a great deal of concern. So David and his men came to the city, and behold, it was burned with fire. and their wives and their sons and their daughters were taken captives. Then David and the people that were with him lifted up their voice and wept until they had no more power to weep. And David's 2 wives were taken captive, Ahinoam the Jezreelitess and Abigail the wife of Nabal the Carmelite. So they found utter devastation, and they found no one alive there. And the scripture is probably understated when it says they wept. You can imagine what that would mean if you were to go home one day and find nothing, including your family, gone. Their possessions had been destroyed or taken. Their families were gone, and they wept emotionally until there was nothing left, no tears to still weep. Well, David reacts in verse 6. And David was greatly distressed. It's hard to put into words what the emotions must have been for David when he looked down on that scene and saw probably the smoke still coming from the burned city and no human life there at all. The term greatly distressed is sometimes used in the Old Testament to indicate being in a tight corner, in a space where there's no room. And that's where David and his men found himself. And to make matters worse, his people found him responsible. They turned on him. Now, they had no rationale for that. There was no basis for that. But in stressful times, people make unusual decisions. And in fact, look at verse 6 again. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spake of stoning him, because the soul of all the people was grieved, every man for his sons and for his daughters. So here is David. I mean, he's utterly devastated himself, and now his people turn on him in an irrational way. People under great stress often make or can make unreasonable decisions. You ever looked at something that someone has done, or maybe something that they have said, and you shake your head and you say, how could they make that decision? How could they say those things? If we take into consideration the effect of stress, we may have some explanation, not an excuse, but some explanation of why people react that way. But verse 6 closes with, I think, with one of the most important phrases in all of this text. The last phrase of verse 6, but David encouraged himself in the Lord his God. We had no one else to turn to. I mean, God sometimes finds us in places where all other resources are closed to us. We're not finding help. We're not finding assistance in any other place or with any other person. There are 2 reasons why this is a most important phrase. David encouraged, some translations have strengthened himself in the Lord. He turned to the Lord because there was no one else to help. I mean, where was he going to go for assistance? His own people had just turned against him. And as he looked around him, he saw no resource, no help. Very discouraging position to be in. Faithful and supportive Abigail, who sustained him previously, was gone. She wasn't available to him. So he turned to the Lord because there was no one else to help. He turned to the Lord because he had done so in the past. His history told him, as he soberly thought about it, there have been many disconcerting situations already for me, particularly those involving Saul, when Saul had repeatedly tried to kill him. And with the help of Jonathan, he was able to evade Saul's attacks. But of course, his ultimate resource was in the Lord, his ready resource. So now David does that again. He encourages himself in the Lord. But now he does turn to another source for a little direction. Verse 7, David said unto Abiathar the priest, Ahimelech's son, I pray thee, bring me hither the ephod. And Abiathar brought thither the ephod to David. And David inquired at the Lord, saying, Shall I pursue after this troop? Shall I overtake them? And he answered him, Pursue, for thou shalt surely overtake them, and without fail recover all. You talk about encouragement. When the Lord answered him in this way. But I was puzzled a little bit by the question that David asked at the beginning. Shall I pursue after this troop? Wouldn't you think that would just be a natural reaction? Well, sure. I mean, my family's gone. All the possessions have been taken. I'm going to go after them. But I think David was very wise. Sometimes knee-jerk reactions can get us into trouble. Sometimes engaging something without thought and without plan can bring us even more problems. So David confirms through the ephod, the priestly garment that contained the Urim and Thummim, and God's answer was so reassuring. It'd be great to go into a conflict knowing that you're going to be the victor, and that's exactly what David did. So verse 9 starts the description. We won't have the time, I don't think, to go through all of this. But David had a successful victory, and I think there are three men or groups of men that will help us break down this. First of all, in verses 9 and 10, so David went, he and the 600 men that were with him, and came to the brook Besor, where those that were left behind stayed. But David pursued, he and 400 men, 200 abode behind, and which were so faint, they were just dead tired, that they could not go over the brook Besor. So here are 200 that had been marching with David, and they stayed behind. The double mention of the brook Besor there could indicate that this was in the springtime of the year, and when those wadis flood, it's very difficult to get across. And this is an inference, at least, that these men didn't think they had the physical strength to be able to ford that raging brook to get to the other side, which they knew they needed to do. But for whatever reason, David allowed them to stay behind, rightfully recognizing their condition. You know, what good are they going to be to me if they don't even have the strength to get across this brook, and we're going to engage in a battle, even though he knew that the victory had been guaranteed. So these men stayed behind. They didn't have the capabilities of the other 400 that continued to follow David. And I thought, you know, is it wise when we face our own challenges, whether they be of a physical nature or some other condition, to compare ourselves with others? And here are two groups. 200 said, we just can't do this. The other 400 went on with David. And I'm sure that the 200 that were left behind after the others left probably rethought, but by that point they were gone and it was too late to join them. Comparison with others and their capabilities can be encouraging, but it can be discouraging as well. You look at a particular situation where you have not been able to engage, whatever it is, and you see others that are successfully doing that, and it can encourage you to make a second effort and say, well, if they can do it, I can do it, and then to go ahead. But there's the other side of the coin as well. It can be discouraging, saying, well, they're doing it, why can't I? They come across, as they continue, one Egyptian man, beginning in verse 11. So we move from 200 men down to one. And they found an Egyptian in the field and brought him to David and gave him bread. And he did eat, and they made him drink water. And they gave him a piece of a cake of figs and 2 clusters of raisins. And when he had eaten, his spirit again came to him, for he had eaten no bread nor drunk any water 3 days and 3 nights. So here's not 200 exhausted men, but one that the Amalekites have left behind. And because of the information that we'll talk about in a minute that he was able to give David, evidently he had been the slave of an important Amalekite leader, because he knew things that normally a slave would not know. So they gave him something to eat, drink, it revived him. And then they continue. Verse 13, David said unto him, to whom belongest thou, and whence art thou? And he said, I am a young man of Egypt, servant to an Amalekite, and my master left me because 3 days ago I fell sick. So they left him behind because he just couldn't continue with them, and essentially abandoned him. Then he tells them, upon guarantee of his own safety, David asked him, what information can you give me? And because at that point, David didn't know where the enemy was. I mean, they had had probably a 3-day advance. He would have had to have looked far and wide across that desert to find them. He couldn't have without some specific directions. And so he asked this young man if he knew, and he did. But he hesitated. He said, well, if I tell you, will you guarantee me safety and promise me that you won't take my life? And of course, David agreed to that. And so based upon the information this young man gave them and the promise that God had already given them, you're going to be victorious. In verse 16, and when he had brought him down, behold, this young man still with them, giving them directions. Behold, they were spread abroad upon all the earth. Now this is the Amalekite army. They've found them. And they are in full celebratory mode. Their partying had been for hours, evidently. Eating and drinking and dancing because of all the great spoil that they had taken out of the land of the Philistines and out of the land of Judah. That's a little additional information that we haven't had. This army had been invading in Judah as well. So now as David considers and engages in this mop-up operation, he's recovering things that he didn't even know that they had. And David, 17, and David smote them from the twilight even unto the evening of the next day. So for 24 hours. Now, here they are partying in no condition to defend themselves, but probably because of superiority in numbers. At this point, David only had 400. And we know that those Philistine armies often numbered in the thousands. So even in spite of the fact that they were in no condition, at least most of them, to defend themselves, David was able to gain the victory after a somewhat extended battle. The end of this particular section, I'll begin at 18. And David recovered all. That's an important word. David recovered all. The Lord had promised him that, and now the Lord is fulfilling his promise, as he always does. He recovered all that the Amalekites had carried away, and David rescued his 2 wives. and there was nothing lacking to them. They weren't missing any people, and they weren't missing any possessions. In fact, now they recovered more than was taken from Ziklag. And there was nothing lacking to them, neither small nor great, neither sons nor daughters, neither spoil nor anything that they had taken to them. David recovered all. And David took all the flocks and the herds which they drove before those other cattle and said, "This is David's spoil." So not only did the nation recover everything, the army recover everything that the nation had been missing, including the raids that were taken into Judah, but David recovered even more. And I guess it's important to understand that this was his last act before he became king. All the things that were taken from Ziklag were recovered. And the chapter goes on to describe the laws containing to spoils. David took all of what they recovered and the other plunder and was going to distribute it to all 600 of his men, even the 200 that had not been able to continue with them. And the 400 objected and said, "Well, they're not responsible for this victory. Why should they share in what we have recovered?" What would your answer be to them? It really wasn't the 400, it was God that helped them recover all of that. And therefore, it's not up to you to decide. And David is displaying wisdom as the anointed king of Israel, although he wasn't reigning at the time. Well, there are several lessons that we can learn from this, and I've pointed out some of them as we have gone through. But let me finish by reading an extended quote that's on the sheet there from Dr. Warren Wiersbe, longtime pastor of Moody Church in Chicago. He says, "As you review what the Lord did for David in that dark hour of his life, you can better understand how he helps his people when problems and crises come into their lives. First, the Lord encouraged David so that he didn't despair but trusted in the Lord to help him. Whenever a crisis comes, we need the courage to face it, and we must not try to blame others or pretend that there is nothing wrong. The Lord also gave David wisdom to know what to do and the strength to do it. He and his men were weary, but the Lord enabled David and his 400 men to persevere in their quest for the Amalekite invaders. The Lord also provided David with the facts he needed so he could find where the enemy was camping in that vast wilderness. When we step out by faith and trust the Lord, he will guide us when we need it. Finally, God gave David and his men the strength they needed to defeat the army and recover the prisoners and their wealth. So it's all about God. The answer to what to do, where to find the resources to be able to do what we know we should do, it's God that's going to provide those for us. I know I'm closing a little bit early, but I'll do this to give you the opportunity to peruse all of the displays back there before the morning service starts. Father, thank you for yourself. How each day we have the opportunity to look to you and say thank you for many things, for many blessings, for the many provisions you make for us. But most of all, we thank you for yourself. You gave yourself to us through the Lord Jesus and his death and resurrection on our behalf. So we really, outside of what you are, have nothing of value. We thank you that we can look forward confidently to the future. We may not have the guarantee that David had of victory, but we do have the promise of your presence with us in whatever situation we find ourselves.